She traded our marriage for the man next door. Now I'm her punishment, silent, relentless, and it's killing her. She thought she could betray him and walk away untouched. But Ethan Bennett wasn't the kind of man to scream or beg. He had something far worse in mind. For 14 years, Laura believed her marriage was unshakable until a single glance at the man next door pulled her into an affair that would shatter everything. When the truth came out, Ethan didn't throw her out immediately. No, he made her live in the ruins she created, trapped in a cold silence that cut deeper than any words. This isn't just a story of infidelity. It's a story of calculated revenge, of a punishment so quiet it echoed louder than rage. You're watching Cheating Stories 7. Hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, do you think silent revenge hurts more than confrontation? Now, let's step into She Destroyed Our Marriage for a Neighbor. Now I'm her silent punishment. The morning in Brookside Heights always began with the same reassuring choreography. Ethan Bennett warmed the kettle while the coffee grinder sang its gravelly song. Laura set plates on the kitchen island, sliding a folded napkin beside each one, like a quiet promise that the day would behave. Liam clattered cleats against the tile, already halfway out the door in his mind. Noah tested lines for the school play, tripping over a joke he promised himself he would master by Friday. The house held these rituals the way a shoreline holds the tide, letting them come and go without argument. Ethan liked order. Order kept bridges standing and subcontractors honest. Order meant Thursday leftovers on Saturday and 3 quick kisses on the porch before he backed the car down the drive. He believed love was a structure you reinforced, not a weather pattern you obeyed. He believed Laura believed that too, because for 14 years she had met him at the same front door with the same soft smile and the same questions about his day. Laura believed in the structure most days. She had left teaching when Noah was born, promising herself she would go back later. But later kept being pushed ahead by recitals, bake sales, science fairs, dentist appointments. She grew skillful at planning other people's hours. Her own became the seam between errands. In the backyard, tomato vines threaded a lattice she built from scrap wood, and basil leaves cupped sunlight like warm hands. Out there, she could be precise without being useful. Nobody asked her what was for dinner. She breathed easier among stems and soil where growth was slow and honest and could not be argued into happening faster. At dinner, Ethan asked questions with his contractor's mind. How was drop-off? Did the principal fix the bus route? Did the booster club settle on jerseys? He admired Laura's answers for their clarity, for the way they kept the family machine oiled. Sometimes he caught the flare of wit in her and wondered whether she missed a classroom's noise. But when he asked, she smiled and said, "I like being here." To Ethan, it sounded like confirmation that the life he was building was holding fast. Sunday evenings were sacred in their small way. A board game nobody finished. A movie paused for baths. A shared bowl of popcorn with 2 small hands fighting over the buttered top layer. After the kids were down, Ethan measured the week ahead in calendars and emails, while Laura wiped a stovetop that was already clean. He glanced up and found her humming. The tune was familiar and lately a little far away, as if it were coming from the next room. The distance was not large. It was the width of a countertop, the delay of a second before she answered, the new habit of looking out the window as if someone had called her name from the street. She would deny it if asked, because nothing dramatic had happened, and because she loved her husband. The love was not in question. The weather, though, had changed in ways only she could feel, a current shifting under a smooth surface. On a Thursday, she drove the long way home after dropping Noah at rehearsal, adding 10 unnecessary minutes. She told herself she was avoiding traffic. In truth, she wanted to pass the river overlook where she and Ethan used to park when Liam was a baby, when money was tight and time was tighter. They ate fast food in the front seat back then, split a milkshake, and dreamed aloud. The overlook was empty now. She stayed in the idling car. The dreams had not died. They had simply settled into furniture, dependable and heavy. She ran a thumb along the seam of the steering wheel and wondered when dependable had started feeling like a weight. That night, Ethan brought home mock-ups for a municipal library edition and spread them across the table with boyish pride. He asked what she thought of the atrium's light. She traced the skylight on paper and genuinely admired the clean geometry. He spoke about drainage materials, cost overruns, and as he did, his face became the face she fell for years ago, intent and generous. She kissed his cheek. He smiled, satisfied, and gathered the pages into tidy stacks. The ritual concluded exactly where it should have, and that exactness, usually comforting, left a small, unfinished note ringing in her chest. In the neighborhood group chat, someone announced a welcome barbecue for a new couple moving onto Maple Court. Laura typed that she would bring a salad, added a smile she did not send, and set the phone down. Outside, dusk lowered itself over the streetlights. Somewhere, a dog barked, and then, remembering itself, went quiet. She told Ethan about the barbecue. He said they should go. "Of course we should," she replied, and meant it. New faces were part of the charm of Brookside Heights. New faces were proof that life still expanded in sensible, neighborly ways. Later in bed, she listened to the familiar orchestra of their home at night, the refrigerator's quiet knock, the floorboard that sighed when the air conditioner came on, Ethan's steady breathing. She placed her hand on his chest. He covered it, half asleep, and within a minute let go. No offense was taken. No hurt was intended. The moment passed unnoticed because there were 1,000 like it, and most of them meant nothing at all. Sleep came, but not before a memory surfaced with the stubbornness of a weed. 18, at a family picnic, catching a stranger's gaze and feeling the ground tilt as if the grass had gone briefly soft. She had told herself for years that she was older now and heavier with wisdom, that the tilt belonged to a child's neck. Still, the memory returned not as a threat, but as a question. What if the tilt was not immaturity? What if it was a compass? She did not want adventure. She wanted surprise without cost, gratitude without the ache of longing. She wanted proof that the life she had chosen could contain a spark that did not ask to burn the house down. On the nightstand, her phone lit with a reminder for Liam's dental cleaning. She silenced it and turned the face down. In the morning, there would be pancakes because Noah had asked. Liam would eat 3 without noticing he was happy. Ethan would kiss her temple and smell like coffee and fresh paper, and the day would begin its practice dance again. Down on Maple Court, a moving truck idled beneath the trees she could not see from her window. Boxes stacked against a new door. A porch light clicked on. 2 shadows crossed and crossed again. The choreography of some other family was beginning, one that had not yet learned the steps. Wind moved through the leaves with the sound of a question that did not require an answer. The harbor held. The boats rocked. Somewhere beyond the breakwater, a weather line drew itself in the dark, straight and patient, as if the sky were marking where calm would end. The Saturday air in Brookside Heights smelled of grilled meat, fresh-cut grass, and the faint sweetness of pies cooling on folding tables. The welcome barbecue for Ryan and Natalie Cole had drawn nearly every family on the block. Kids darted between lawn chairs, the metallic hiss of soda cans cracked open, mixing with bursts of laughter. It was the kind of gathering Laura had attended dozens of times before. Safe, predictable, rooted in neighborly goodwill. Ryan stood near the drinks table, easy in his stance, a tumbler of lemonade in hand. He was younger than Ethan by close to 10 years, with dark hair that caught the sun and a smile that seemed practiced yet unforced. He listened with a slight tilt of his head, the way people do when they want you to believe you have their full attention. Laura noticed him before she meant to, scanning the crowd out of idle habit. Their eyes met across the lawn, and the background noise thinned to a hum. The moment was brief, no more than a couple of seconds, but it landed with the quiet force of déjà vu. It was the same magnetic pull she had felt at 18, when she first saw Daniel Reed at that long-ago family picnic. That old, ungovernable rush bloomed in her chest, confusing and exhilarating in equal measure. She looked away first, pretending to rearrange the cutlery on her plate. Later, their paths crossed near the dessert table. "Hi, I'm Ryan," he said, voice smooth with just enough warmth to make it feel personal. Laura introduced herself, adding that she and Ethan lived 3 houses down. Ryan smiled as if committing it to memory. "Good to know. You'll have to tell me which days are best for neighborhood gatherings." The exchange was light, appropriate, harmless to anyone watching. But Ryan's gaze lingered half a beat too long, his eyes holding hers like they'd already agreed on a secret. Laura felt her cheeks warm, and she busied herself pouring coffee. From across the yard, Ethan was deep in conversation with 3 of his golf buddies, animatedly discussing a new construction project. He didn't see any of it. When the afternoon wound down and neighbors began stacking chairs and gathering plates, Laura caught sight of Ryan again. This time he was laughing with Natalie, his hand resting casually on her shoulder. Laura told herself she was foolish to have felt anything. Even so, that night, lying in bed beside Ethan's steady breathing, she replayed those 2 seconds in her mind. The way the air had shifted, the way her pulse had quickened, and the unsettling truth that she couldn't quite decide if it was nothing at all or the start of something she should fear. A week after the barbecue, Ethan suggested they stop by the new luxury dealership on the edge of town. Their family SUV had been making a strange noise, and he thought it might be time to trade up. The place gleamed with glass walls and polished chrome, every car under the lights looking like it belonged in a magazine spread. Laura followed Ethan through the showroom, her heels clicking against the spotless floor. Salesmen in tailored suits moved like practiced dancers between clients. And then there he was, Ryan Cole, emerging from an office with a folder in hand. His surprise at seeing them registered for only a moment before his expression shifted into that slow, confident smile. "Ethan, Laura, small world," he said, shaking Ethan's hand. "I'm in finance here. If you're buying, I'll make sure you get the best deal." While Ethan went off with a salesman to test drive a midnight blue SUV, Ryan gestured toward his glass-walled office. "Come in, have a seat. I'll get us some coffee." His tone was casual, but Laura felt the same taut undercurrent she'd sensed at the barbecue. They talked about the neighborhood, how Natalie was settling in, how Ryan was still learning the street names. He asked about her garden, remembering details from their brief exchange before. The conversation felt easy, yet each sentence seemed to carry a weight just beneath the surface. Then, as he handed her the coffee, he said it. "I hope we'll be seeing more of each other." It was delivered like a half-joke, with just enough ambiguity to leave her unsure of how to take it. She gave a polite smile, keeping her voice neutral. "I'm sure we will." By the time Ethan returned, grinning about the car's smooth handling, the air in the room had shifted back to normal. Papers were signed, hands were shaken, and they left with a promise to think it over. 3 days later, Laura's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Want to grab a coffee?" R. She stared at it for a long minute. She could delete it, pretend she never saw it. Instead, she typed, "Where?" They met at a small cafe 2 towns over, the kind with weathered brick walls and the smell of ground beans hanging in the air. They sat in a corner booth, talking about innocuous things, travel, books, the best restaurants nearby. But every now and then, Ryan's gaze locked on hers, with an intensity that made her forget the words in her mouth. When they parted, nothing inappropriate had happened. No touches lingered, no lines were crossed. And yet, as she drove home, Laura's pulse still hadn't settled. She told herself it was just coffee, just conversation. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had already stepped onto a path that led somewhere she wasn't supposed to go. The messages between Laura and Ryan had taken on a rhythm, an almost daily exchange that slid easily into her routine. It started innocently, comments about the weather, a funny photo from the neighborhood. But somewhere along the way, the tone shifted. Compliments appeared between the lines. Jokes carried a sharper edge, brushing against boundaries without quite breaking them. On a Thursday morning, after dropping Liam and Noah at their sports practice, Laura's phone buzzed. "Natalie's at work. Want to stop by? Just to talk." She stared at the screen, every rational instinct telling her to ignore it. And yet, a restless energy pulsed through her. Before she could talk herself out of it, she typed, 10 minutes. Ryan's house was quiet, sunlight pooling on the hardwood floors. He offered her coffee and they sat in the living room, conversations circling mundane topics. How the neighborhood seemed livelier lately, how he was still learning the best routes to work. Laura told herself this was safe, controlled. Then came a pause, a long, unbroken silence. She looked up from her cup to find Ryan watching her, his expression unreadable but intense. He leaned forward slightly as if testing how far he could go before she moved away. She didn't. When he closed the distance, his hand brushing her cheek, Laura's breath caught. The first kiss was tentative, a question. The second carried the answer. The rush of adrenaline was immediate and overwhelming, a mix of danger and desire that made her pulse hammer in her ears. One moment they were seated. The next, the world had narrowed to the heat of his touch and the quickening pace of her own heartbeat. The logic that should have stopped her felt distant, muffled, as if it belonged to someone else. When she finally stood to leave, her hands trembled as she reached for her bag. Ryan walked her to the door without a word. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper. She told herself this was a single mistake, something she could lock away and never repeat. But deep down, under the layers of guilt and shock, another truth whispered. She didn't really want it to be the last time. In the weeks that followed, Laura's schedule began to take on a new shape, one that Ethan never questioned. She lingered at the grocery store, strolling slowly through aisles she didn't need anything from. She volunteered for PTA meetings she once avoided, claiming she wanted to be more involved now that the boys were older. If Ethan noticed how often she left the house without a clear reason, he didn't show it. To him, this was Laura reclaiming her social life after years of focusing solely on home. In reality, those extra hours were often spent with Ryan. Sometimes it was a quick coffee in a tucked-away cafe. Other times, a stolen afternoon in his house when they knew Natalie was at work. They never spoke of love. The connection between them was electric but shallow, fueled by secrecy and the thrill of getting away with something forbidden. It was a dangerous game, and Laura was becoming addicted to the high it gave her. But the game left traces she couldn't fully hide. At home, sitting across from Ethan at dinner, she sometimes caught herself glancing away too quickly when his eyes met hers. His casual questions, how was the meeting, did you run into anyone you know, would make her pulse skip. Her answers came too fast, too rehearsed. She could hear the edge in her own voice. More than once, she caught subtle shifts in the way a few neighbors looked at her. Mrs. Dempsey, who lived across the street, seemed to pause longer than usual when waving hello. Another neighbor mentioned, in a tone too light to be innocent, "I've seen you out and about a lot lately." The whispers hadn't reached Ethan's ears yet, but Laura felt them closing in like the tightening loop of a noose. Still, the pull toward Ryan was stronger than her fear. Each meeting only deepened her need to see him again, to feel that reckless spark one more time. And so, even as shadows of suspicion began to creep in from the edges of her perfect suburban life, she kept walking the same dangerous path, knowing full well that sooner or later, someone would follow her footprints. It was a Thursday morning, quiet enough that Laura could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of Ryan's house settling in the sunlight. Natalie was at work, at least that's what Laura believed, and the boys were safely at school. She had told Ethan she'd be running errands all morning, nothing unusual. Upstairs, the blinds were drawn halfway, casting striped shadows across the bedroom. Ryan lay back against the pillows, speaking lazily about a trip he wanted to take someday. Laura half listened, more attuned to the warm, reckless thrum in her chest than to his words. Then came the sound, faint at first, then unmistakable, the front door opening. Her head snapped toward the hallway. "Was that?" she began. Ryan frowned, swinging his legs over the bed. "Probably nothing, maybe a package." It wasn't nothing. The footsteps moved fast, purposeful. And then the voice, sharp, unfamiliar, cutting through the air. "Ryan?" Before either of them could react, the bedroom door slammed open. Mrs. Harper, Natalie's mother, stood in the doorway, her face a mask of shock that hardened into rage within seconds. "What is this?" she spat, her voice rising to a scream before anyone could answer. She went for Ryan first, the flat of her palm connecting with his cheek in a resounding crack that made Laura flinch. Ryan tried to shield himself, but misses. Harper's nails caught his skin, leaving a red slash across his jaw. Then she turned on Laura. "You!" The rest dissolved into a tangle of shouted insults as her hands found Laura's hair, yanking hard enough to make her stumble. The impact against the wall knocked the breath out of her. Laura's instincts took over. She pulled away, scrambling for her scattered clothes. Buttons slipped through trembling fingers as misses. Harper advanced again, shouting words Laura couldn't fully process over the pounding in her ears. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard Ryan yelling, trying to pull his attacker back. Laura didn't stop to see how it ended. Clutching her half-buttoned blouse, she bolted for the back stairs, bare feet slapping against the wood. The morning air outside was sharp, almost icy against her flushed skin. She ran until she reached her car, parked discreetly a block away, and slammed the door behind her. Her hands shook on the steering wheel the whole drive home. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, as if misses. Harper's fury could follow her through the streets. But the worst wasn't over. By midday, her phone was a hive of notifications, missed calls, texts from neighbors, messages in the community group chat. "Is it true? I can't believe you do this to Ethan. We saw her car at Ryan's house this morning." Laura didn't respond. She sat in her kitchen, staring at the pattern of sunlight on the floor, trying to slow her breathing. Outside, she imagined curtains twitching, neighbors passing information from one porch to another. Brookside Heights had always been a place where nothing stayed secret for long. By evening, she could feel the shift in the air. Every glance from a passing car, every shadow that lingered on the sidewalk outside her home seemed sharper, heavier. The story was no longer just hers and Ryan's. It belonged to the entire neighborhood now. And it was only a matter of time before it reached Ethan. Ethan came home just before sunset, the glow of the street lamps flickering on outside as he pulled into the driveway. From the kitchen window, Laura saw him step out of the car. Normally, he'd glance toward the house, maybe even wave if he knew she was watching. Tonight, his eyes were fixed on the front door, his jaw set in a line so rigid it made her stomach knot. She opened the door before he could knock or fumble with his keys. "Ethan," she began, but her voice cracked on the first syllable. His gaze was steady, cold. "Is it true?" he asked, the words so even that for a moment she could almost pretend this was a normal question. Her throat closed. Ethan, please, let me explain." He stepped back as if even her proximity was offensive. "No, I don't want an explanation. I want you to get out of this house." The finality in his tone was worse than shouting. It was the sound of a decision already made. Laura's knees weakened. She reached for him instinctively, but he shifted away, the space between them suddenly vast. "Please, just listen," she begged, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake. Stop." The word was quiet but heavy. "I don't want to hear it. I already heard enough." She knew what that meant. The whispers had reached him. Maybe even the details from someone who'd seen her car outside Ryan's that morning. A flash of misses. Harper's furious face crossed her mind, and Laura knew there was no salvaging the story. When her tears came, they were messy and desperate. "I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family." Ethan's eyes softened for half a second, then hardened again. "Call your mother, or I will." It was a dismissal, not an argument. Laura realized with a sinking heart that there would be no screaming match, no chance to sway him with emotion. This was worse. He was shutting the door on her entirely. She moved through the bedroom in a daze, pulling clothes from drawers without caring if they matched. A small overnight bag filled quickly, absurd in its size compared to the life she was being told to leave behind. From the hallway, she could hear Ethan's low voice on the phone. "Yes, she needs a place to stay tonight. Can you come get her?" A pause. "I'll explain later." By the time her mother arrived, headlights spilling across the front lawn, Laura felt wrung out and hollow. Ethan didn't meet her eyes as he handed over the bag. There was no anger in his face now, just a tired kind of resolve. She stood on the porch for a moment, wanting to say something, anything that might make him turn toward her, but he only stepped back into the house. The door closed with a quiet, final click. It wasn't the slam she'd feared. It was worse. It was the sound of something ending without ceremony, without a chance to fight for it. And as she walked toward her mother's car, the house behind her looked like it belonged to someone else entirely. Laura's childhood bedroom felt smaller than she remembered. The pale yellow walls, once warm and comforting, now seemed to close in around her. The old bookshelf still lined with faded paperbacks. The quilt her mother had sewn years ago covering the bed. It should have been familiar, safe, but all she could feel was the sharp edge of displacement. She avoided looking out the front windows during the day. Her parents' house was only a few streets away from Brookside Heights, close enough that she occasionally saw familiar cars drive past. She imagined the conversations happening in those vehicles. That's where Laura Bennett's been staying. Every morning she reached for her phone before she even got out of bed, hoping for a message from Ethan. Most days there was nothing. On the rare occasions she gathered the courage to call, it went to voicemail. She'd leave short messages, careful, measured, asking how he was, how the boys were. Hours, sometimes days later, she might receive a single-line reply. "They're fine," or "busy right now." One evening he picked up. The sound of his voice sent a rush of hope through her, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Laura," he said, calm but distant, "I need time. I'm not ready to see you." She tried to reason with him, her words spilling over one another, but he ended the call with a polite, final goodbye. At night, she lay awake listening to the old house settle, the ticking of the hallway clock loud in the silence. Regret gnawed at her, not just for the affair, but for the thousand small choices that had led to it. The coffee meetings, the texts she could have ignored, the day she'd walked into Ryan's house. More than once, she considered driving back to their home unannounced, just to see him, to force a conversation. But she pictured the look on his face during that last confrontation, the way he had stepped back from her touch, and the thought stopped her cold. The uncertainty was the worst part, not knowing if this exile was temporary punishment or the first stage of a permanent end. And as the night stretched on, she began to fear the answer. Days at her parents' house blurred together, but Laura's thoughts were anything but dull. Each morning she woke with the same gnawing certainty. If she didn't act soon, Ethan would close the door on their marriage forever. Apologies weren't enough. She had already used those words until they were threadbare. What she needed was a gesture so dramatic, so self-sacrificing, that it would prove she was willing to do anything to keep him. One night, long after her parents had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and began researching postnuptial agreements. The language was cold, full of legal terms, but the meaning was clear. She could write into law her own punishment should she betray him again. The next day, she called half a dozen attorneys before finding one willing to take her case. Some declined outright, saying her proposed terms were too lopsided to be realistic. Finally, a gray-haired lawyer in a quiet downtown office listened without judgment. "If this is what you want," he said, "we can draft it, but once it's signed, there's no undoing it without his consent." Laura didn't hesitate. The agreement would grant Ethan nearly all of their marital assets if they stayed married for a minimum of 30 months. If she were ever unfaithful again, she would forfeit everything. No claim on the house, savings, or even spousal support. She would also agree to secure a full-time job within 6 months, contributing her share to household expenses. And then came the clause she knew would shock him. Ethan could see other women if he wished, without it being considered infidelity. She told herself this was symbolic, a way to show she accepted complete vulnerability. Deep down, she believed he would never take advantage of it. When she presented the agreement to him 2 weeks later, they sat across from each other at the long oak dining table in what had once been their home. Ethan read silently, his brow furrowing in places, his eyes narrowing in others. "This is extreme," he finally said, glancing up at her. "I know," Laura replied, her voice steady despite the thundering of her pulse. "But I need you to see that I'm willing to give you everything because you're worth more to me than any of it." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Then Ethan leaned back, exhaling. "I'll agree," he said slowly, "on one condition. Her heart leapt until he spoke again. No intimacy, none, not until I decide, and I may never decide. The words hit like a blow, but she nodded. She told herself it was temporary, that with time and effort she could win him back. She would endure the coldness, the absence, because this was still better than losing him completely. When he signed the papers, his pen barely paused over the page. For Ethan, it was a contract of protection. For Laura, it was a lifeline, thin, fragile, and entirely in his hands. When Laura moved back into the house, the first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable quiet they used to share on lazy Sunday mornings, but a deliberate, measured absence of sound. Ethan spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional, about the boys' school schedules, bills that needed paying, appointments that couldn't be missed. They no longer shared a bedroom. Ethan had moved his things into the guest room at the end of the hall. At night, she could hear the muted creak of the door closing after he disappeared into that space. A quiet thud that carried more weight than any slammed door could have. Dinner, once a family ritual, had fractured. The boys ate early, often with Laura, while Ethan would wait until later, preparing something simple for himself. On the rare occasions they were in the kitchen at the same time, they moved around each other like strangers in a narrow hallway, careful not to brush against one another. There were no touches, no casual hand on the shoulder, no brushing past in the hallway with a murmured, "Excuse me." Smiles, when they happened at all, were directed toward the boys, never toward each other. Laura tried at first to close the gap. She would comment on something in the news, ask about his projects at work, share a small anecdote from her day. His responses were polite but brief, as though every extra word cost him more than he was willing to spend. Eventually, she stopped trying, afraid that even her smallest efforts might irritate him further. The house itself seemed to absorb the tension. Conversations in the living room felt muted, the air in the kitchen heavy. The walls held the memory of laughter and warmth, but now they only reflected the sharp edges of restraint. At night, lying alone in their bed, Laura would stare at the ceiling and listen for the faint sound of Ethan moving in the other room. She imagined him awake too, staring at his own ceiling, counting the days until the 30 months were over. She had gotten what she asked for, a chance to stay, but it felt less like coming home and more like serving a sentence. One where both of them were the jailers and the prisoners. Months passed, marked not by shared moments, but by the slow, quiet erosion of whatever connection had once tied them together. Laura and Ethan moved through the same house like parallel lines, never intersecting, never colliding, simply existing in proximity. To the boys, life looked mostly the same. Birthdays were still celebrated. Holiday decorations still went up on time. Both parents still attended school events. In public, Laura and Ethan played their parts well, offering polite smiles for the sake of appearances. They stood side by side at soccer games, clapping for Liam's goals or Noah's saves. But there was always a careful gap between them, wide enough for anyone paying attention to notice. At home, the distance was more tangible. Mornings began with the sound of separate alarms and ended with each heading in different directions. In the evenings, they often occupied separate rooms, Ethan in the study with his laptop, Laura in the living room pretending to watch television while her mind wandered. She made small attempts to bridge the gap. A casual question about his day, a comment about something funny one of the boys had said. Sometimes he would answer, tone neutral, eyes fixed on whatever task was in front of him. Other times, he wouldn't look up at all. Laura told herself she understood. He was protecting himself, drawing a boundary so deep she could never cross it again. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. She missed the small intimacies, the easy banter over morning coffee, the shared glances across a crowded room, the feeling that they were on the same team. In rare moments when the boys had gone to bed and the house was still, she would catch a glimpse of Ethan passing through the hallway. There was no malice in his expression, only a cool detachment, as if she were a distant acquaintance rather than the woman he had once vowed to love. They had kept the marriage alive in name and for the children's sake, but the soul of it, the warmth, the trust, the sense of being each other's home, was gone. and Laura began to wonder if she was clinging to something that no longer existed, except as a memory neither of them was willing to speak aloud. If the walls inside the Bennett house felt cold, the world outside was worse. Laura had once been part of the neighborhood's heartbeat, helping organize block parties, trading recipes over coffee, hosting playdates for the boys. Now, every trip beyond the front door felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone had already read the script and her role was the disgraced lead. The invitations stopped first. Group texts about weekend barbecues and school fundraisers went silent on her phone. When she passed familiar faces on the sidewalk, greetings became curt nods, if they came at all. Some neighbors turned their heads entirely, pretending to be absorbed in their phones or conversations as she walked by. Word spread quickly that Natalie had divorced Ryan. The two no longer appeared together, but Natalie stayed in the same house, her children playing in the same yards where Laura's boys had once chased soccer balls. Sometimes Laura would see her across the street, chatting with another neighbor, their heads bent together in easy camaraderie. The sight brought a mix of guilt and defensiveness. Natalie's pain was undeniable, but Laura couldn't help feeling like she was still being tried in a court with no appeal. Trips outside became calculated maneuvers. She timed her grocery runs for late evenings, when most porch lights were off and the sidewalks were empty. Afternoons were spent in the backyard where high fences offered a sliver of privacy. The garden became her sanctuary again, not for joy this time, but as a shield. She would kneel among the tomato plants or prune the roses, pretending the thrum of life beyond the fence didn't exist. The boys, blissfully unaware of the full weight of the situation, moved freely through the neighborhood. Their friends still came over, laughter spilling into the yard, and sometimes even Natalie's kids joined in. Laura would watch from the kitchen window, unseen, grateful that the children hadn't inherited the grudges of their parents. But she knew she couldn't hide forever. Every time she stepped onto the front porch, she felt the weight of unseen eyes, the whispered fragments of conversations that stopped when she drew near. Brookside Heights had become a prison without bars. And the sentence felt indefinite, served under the open sky, surrounded by manicured lawns and neighbors who once knew her name, and now only knew her shame. By the time autumn rolled around, Laura had grown tired of the daily strain, the careful choreography of avoiding Ethan's gaze in their own kitchen, the awkward silences at the dinner table, the constant reminder that she was unwanted in the very house she'd once built a life in. The walls of Brookside Heights felt too close, the stairs too heavy. One night, while lying awake in the quiet guest room she still called her own, the idea took root. Maybe they needed space. Real space, not just emotional distance. If she moved out, even temporarily, it might break the stalemate. Maybe absence could do what words and promises had failed to accomplish. She found a small apartment a few blocks from the boys' school. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, a balcony that looked out over a row of maple trees. But it was hers. When she told Ethan her plan, she expected an argument or even a shrug of indifference. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, brow furrowed as though trying to read her intentions. "If that's what you want," he finally said, "then do it." His voice carried no anger, but the surprise in his eyes lingered. The first week in the apartment felt strange. She arranged furniture, hung curtains, stocked the fridge, all while waiting for some sign from Ethan. It came in small ways, a text about the boys' homework, a quick call to coordinate soccer practice pickup. Then, slowly, the conversations lengthened. One evening, he phoned to ask about a plumbing issue at the house, and they ended up talking for nearly an hour, about work, about the boys, even about a TV show they'd once watched together. The warmth in his voice wasn't the same as before, but it was enough to stir a fragile hope inside her. Laura began to think the gamble might pay off. She imagined him missing her presence in the house, realizing the quiet wasn't the same without her there. Each time the phone rang and his name lit up the screen, she felt the faintest pull towards something that resembled the connection they had lost. But beneath the cautious optimism, A question she didn't dare voice lingered. Was he reaching out because he missed her, or simply because the logistics of their lives demanded it? The calls became a rhythm Laura clung to. Some evenings they lasted 20 minutes, other times an hour. Ethan's voice, steady and measured, no longer carried the cold edge it once had. They talked about the boys' progress at school, shared light complaints about the early darkness of winter, even laughed together once or twice, reminiscing about a family vacation years ago. Those moments were intoxicating in their normalcy. Laura began to believe she could feel the ice thawing, layer by layer. She imagined Ethan sitting in the study, leaning back in his chair, letting his guard down without realizing it. The sound of him exhaling before speaking felt like an opening, an invitation. One night, buoyed by the easy flow of conversation, she tried to take a step forward. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe we could have dinner together sometime, just the two of us." The pause on the other end stretched too long. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was neutral. "The boys would probably enjoy that." She swallowed, forcing a smile into her tone. "I meant just you and me." Another silence, then the faint scrape of a chair moving and his voice, calm but firm. "Laura, let's not do this right now." It happened again on other calls. Whenever she hinted at meeting for something that wasn't purely logistical or mentioned missing how things used to be, Ethan would either change the subject or end the conversation. There was no anger in his tone, but the wall was still there, unbroken, perhaps even reinforced. Laura told herself not to push too hard, that patience was the key. Yet each deflection chipped away at the hope she was so carefully nurturing. The warmth she thought she felt might have been nothing more than courtesy, the kind extended to someone you can't fully forgive, but no longer wish to fight with. And so she stayed in the apartment, waiting for a sign that might never come, mistaking politeness for progress and conversation for reconciliation. The more she reached for the future she wanted, the more it seemed to slip into the shadow of the past Ethan couldn't forget. Nearly 2 years had passed since that Thursday morning when everything came apart. In that time, Laura had grown accustomed to living in the in-between, a life suspended between hope and resignation. The apartment had become familiar. The boys split their time between her place and the house on Brookside Heights. She had learned to accept that Ethan would engage with her on practical matters, but never on anything deeper. When he called and asked to meet one Saturday afternoon, she felt an unfamiliar jolt of optimism. They met at a quiet cafe, the kind of place where they had once lingered over coffee and talked about weekend plans. But Ethan's expression as he sat down across from her was not one of reconciliation. His hands folded on the table, his eyes steady. "Laura," he began, his tone deliberate, "I think it's time we end this, officially." The words landed like a blow she hadn't braced for. "End this, what do you mean?" "I mean divorce." He didn't look away. "We've been living apart in every way that matters. I've tried to move forward, but I can't, not while we're still legally tied. I can't erase what happened, but maybe, if we're not husband and wife anymore, I can let go of some of the anger." She searched his face for a trace of uncertainty, something she could work with. "Ethan, we can still fix this. I've changed. I've done everything I can to prove." He shook his head gently. "You've done what you could, and I appreciate it. But for me, the trust is gone. Without that, what are we even rebuilding?" Her throat tightened. "We're rebuilding us," she said, her voice breaking. "The life we had, the family. We'll always be a family for the boys," he interrupted, his tone softening slightly. "But for us, that ended a long time ago." Laura reached across the table, but he didn't take her hand. The space between them felt like miles. For the rest of the conversation, she tried everything, reminding him of the years they had shared, the milestones they had celebrated, even the post-nuptial agreement she had signed to prove her commitment. Ethan listened, but his expression never wavered. His decision had been made long before he walked into the cafe. When they left, the winter air cut against her cheeks, sharp and unyielding. Ethan gave her a brief nod before walking to his car. No hug, no lingering glance. As she stood there watching him drive away, Laura understood with a hollow clarity there would be no second chance. No miracle of forgiveness. This was the final break. and nothing she said or did could pull them back from the edge they had crossed long ago. The divorce papers arrived in a neat, cream-colored envelope, so ordinary in appearance that, for a brief second, Laura could almost pretend they were something else. But as she spread them out on the small kitchen table in her apartment, the legal language felt like the final nails in a coffin she had been building for years. She read each page slowly, though nothing inside was surprising. It followed the postnuptial terms she herself had insisted on. Ethan would keep nearly all their shared assets: the house, the savings, the investments. She would walk away with her personal belongings and a modest bank account balance that wouldn't last a year if she wasn't careful. When the pen hovered over the signature line, she thought about the day she had first walked into that house in Brookside Heights, full of hope and certainty that she was building a life that would last forever. Her hand trembled as she signed, the ink flowing smoothly, sealing the end of that life in less than a second. The court date was swift and clinical. Ethan was there, composed, dressed in the quiet confidence of someone who had long since made peace with the decision. He spoke politely when necessary, but didn't meet her eyes for more than a heartbeat. The judge's final words were simple: "You are now divorced." And just like that, 2 decades of marriage were reduced to a line in a court record. Ethan left the courthouse with an ease in his stride she hadn't seen in years. She watched him from a distance as he got into his car, the sun catching the edge of his profile. It was the look of a man who had finally set down a heavy weight. In the weeks that followed, word trickled back to her through mutual acquaintances. Ethan seemed lighter, calmer. He was spending more time with friends, had even started training for a charity cycling event. The boys spoke of weekends with him filled with projects and outings, their voices warm and animated. Laura, meanwhile, moved through her days like a shadow. She went to work, came home, filled the silence with the hum of the television she barely watched. Nights were the worst, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision that had led her here. The laughter they once shared at midnight, the private rituals only they understood, the comfort of knowing he was hers, all gone, replaced by an emptiness she couldn't fill. Regret was no longer a passing ache. It was a constant companion. She knew she had destroyed something rare and irreplaceable, and there was no redemption left to find. Sometimes she drove past Brookside Heights, slowing as she neared the house. The lights in the windows glowed softly, and for a moment she could almost believe she was coming home. But the driveway was no longer hers, the life inside no longer waiting for her. Ethan had found his freedom. All she had was the memory of what she'd thrown away, and the knowledge that she would carry its weight for the rest of her life. And that was the end of Ethan and Laura's marriage. Her affair with the neighbor didn't just destroy their home. It left her living in a silent prison of regret, watching the life she threw away bloom without her. Ethan didn't need to shout, threaten, or humiliate her. His quiet absence became the most devastating punishment of all. Betrayal has a price, and sometimes that price is paid for the rest of your life. If it were you, would you have forgiven Laura or walked away like Ethan? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe to Cheating Stories 7, and share this video with someone who loves a good twist. See you in the next story.